Hello and welcome to the Energy Intelligence Podcast. I'm Alex Schindelar. I'm the President of Energy Intelligence, and I have with me the Deputy Bureau Chief of our Washington, D.C. office, Emily Meredith, with me today. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Alex.
So, Emily, I wanted to start with a question that's on a lot of people's minds when it comes to the U.S.-Iran buildup of tensions, which you've been covering very closely over the last couple of months. What people are wondering is whether we are on a path towards war. There was plenty of speculation over the last couple of weeks that we could have been even minutes away from a large military conflict. But I think we've detected over the last week or so potentially it could be a shift in the U.S. approach or Trump's approach to an engagement with Iran, so potentially a de-escalation. So maybe you can talk a bit about that. Do you see this as a realistic move from sort of build up to war to a potentially path towards negotiations?
So there are a couple of things at play there. First, Trump has always signaled, right, that he is not interested in a protracted conflict in the Middle East. He's been very critical of the Iraq War, despite his very early support of the Iraq War. He now denies that he didn't support it, denies that he supported it. And so I think, that's one issue, right? But the Trump administration's policy towards Tehran has been pretty tough. Trump came in on the campaign trail. He was saying he didn't like the Iran nuclear deal. He pulled out after, I guess, about a year ago. And then the Trump administration decided they needed to go harder. They weren't seeing the changes that they wanted in Iran. And in the Iran government's behavior. And so they decided to really ramp up their economic pressure campaign. They call it their maximum pressure campaign, with tougher sanctions beginning at the end of April. And that I guess I raised that because there are two players in this. And whether or not Iran can withstand that pressure is another issue. Now, the question is sometimes, does the Trump administration want war? And I think we have a record of certain advisors, most notably John Bolton, advocating for military strikes in Iran. There have been these plans for a while. I guess Department of Defense, strategy planning about what would limited strikes look like. I mean, these have sat around for years. So those periodically get some attention. The shift that I think is the most notable, and I don't know that it is, it's hard to frame it as softer or more peaceful, but Donald Trump himself has focused more in the last several weeks on the nuclear aspects of the deal, which obviously is chiefly what the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action agreed to under the Obama administration in 2015 addressed, and it's mainly addressed. There were a couple of other missile-related issues in that agreement, but Trump over the weekend made some remarks, and he really hit at the nuclear deal itself, and he said, it's just not acceptable that they get nuclear weapons. But that is really different from what the administration has been saying since last May. And what we hear from others in the administration is that this rhetoric about Iran needs to behave as a normal country, and this 12 list of demands that Mike Pompeo laid out in May of 2018 that really require Iran to fundamentally shift certain aspects of how it conducts policy in the region, and those were seen as non-starters. Now, the other reason it's hard to know is Trump says this, and he's focusing on the nuclear issue, and then 2 days later, his special envoy for Iran issues, Brian Hook, is out giving remarks, and he's pulling up, he's bringing up some of these 12 demands again. So what could be a change, and we've seen this in the last several weeks, is Trump himself focusing on the nuclear issue. That, I think, limiting to the nuclear portfolio is something that would be easier for Tehran to think about. What is not clear is whether that is something that the entire administration agrees on. And obviously the president is the one who makes the decisions, right? But if you have people who are at a more functional level on negotiations, still fixating on these other issues, that could be a little harder.
Well, so do you think that maybe people have been over-focusing on John Bolton and his past and potentially interpreting sort of Bolton's worldview onto Trump too much in this period? Or do you think there has actually been potentially some change of direction where what Bolton was sort of saying and pursuing was in line with what Trump was pursuing, and then Trump has kind of potentially pulled back from maybe where Bolton would like things to go?
It's a really interesting question. And I think, short of being Trump and Bolton, we're not going to have a definitive answer. But, Donald Trump himself has, I wouldn't say he's distanced himself, but he's been asked several times over the last couple of weeks, are you with your national security advisor? Something along those lines. And he'll say, yes, John Bolton has my support, but he's not the only guy in the room. I like John. He's kind of a hawk. I don't always agree with him. Trump has this reputation of liking to have a lot of diverse views. I think that it is right to focus on the national security advisor's way of thinking about the world and America's place in the world. And, at the end of the day, the national security advisor has a big functional role to play on how U.S. foreign policy is conducted. But, how, like I just said, Trump is the one who makes the decisions. It is possible that Bolton's tough talk. Trump does like to talk very tough, right? This is very obvious. It's possible that, Trump liked where Bolton was at several weeks ago. And now that the cost has been raised and, with the attacks on tankers, with the attacks on the East-West pipeline, with Iran downing a U.S. drone. It's possible that the idea of military conflict has been made more salient to him, and so the administration has stepped back. It's also possible that, because Trump has this reputation of not wanting war, not wanting conflict in the Middle East, not wanting the U.S. to, essentially have another Iraq, that the administration needed to talk really tough in order to convince people that they were willing to go to war. Because, the threat of military action is sometimes necessary to back up diplomatic engagement. And so, it's possible also that what we were seeing was the administration trying to make the point that Trump is reluctant, but they really are willing to do something.
So let's put our kind of thinking hats on and knowing that we're not really sure where this is going. But if we can kind of set the parameters that on one hand, Trump doesn't really like war, and that remains kind of a last resort, whatever the kind of public rhetoric is. And then on the other hand, we've got this sort of idea that you could have Iran and the U.S. would sit down and sort of magically come to terms on 40 years of conflict. What could some form of negotiations look like? How could a process of negotiation go between the U.S. and Iran?
So I think the biggest the biggest factor is going to be what is in the negotiations. And like we talked about, if it's the nuclear portfolio almost exclusively, then and the nuclear portfolio almost exclusively where some degree of Iranian enrichment is accepted, I mean, what you're essentially looking at is a repackaged Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal that was agreed to in 2015. I think that Trump he wants to have something better than what Obama had. If that's the process, if that's the goal, then the process, I think it's easier than if the Trump administration really wants to address, ballistic missiles, if they really want to address Iran's, what they'll call, regional, like maligned regional action. I mean, those are harder issues to get to. Now, the Iranians have said they're not going to sit at the table unless the Trump administration offers some sanctions relief at the start. And I think in some ways, the Trump administration has given themselves a little bit of running room there, because they have ratcheted the sanctions up so much, right? So, if the starting point a year ago, May, was that there were sanctions on Iran, but Iran was getting some of the sanctions relief that had been outlined under the JCPOA. They were exporting, about 2.5 million barrels of oil a day, getting the revenues from that. In November of last year, you had the snapback, in which their exports really dropped, and then we've had exports drop pretty precipitously, basically to all-time lows, around, under 200,000 barrels a day, I think, was a recent figure that we compiled. And so that is a lot tougher for Iran. But then in addition to that, you had sanctions threatened against Javad Zarif. You've had sanctions put in place against Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And so, the U.S. has essentially given itself more by being tougher now. I mean, this is part of the maximum pressure campaign. I believe that they're trying to affect behavior there, but there are essentially more things that they can offer at the outset specifically because they've gone so hard recently. But so, I guess one question is, does the U.S. offer some sanctions relief at the beginning? What does that sanctions relief look like? And both countries have to be able to package whatever negotiations are going on as a win. And I think that's really hard. I think that's hard for the Trump administration, and I think it's also hard for Iran.
Well, when you put it like that, you can start to imagine that potentially all of this has been sort of lead up to negotiations, potentially, where even the kind of threat of military action was part of this sort of pushing to the edge just to pull back again to kind of demonstrate everyone's serious, put on extra sanctions as a show of kind of, we didn't strike you, but we're going to pile some sanctions on top of you. But that allows you down the road to sort of pull those sanctions back off with very minimal kind of impact on Iran's economy as a gesture to even start things off. And you don't really give up very much by that, because frankly, that last round of sanctions, as I think we've said very clearly in our coverage, has been sort of token sanctions and not sort of, not really increasing pressure much more than it already is. So potentially this whole thing could be a large kind of, well, I don't want to say a conspiracy, but some sort of dance or kind of orchestration to kind of get where everyone thinks that they should be getting, which is a sit down and talk with each other.
Yeah, but I think that that's also what the Trump administration says they're trying to do, right? They say that they are this maximum economic pressure campaign the point of it is to change Iranian behavior. Now, the debate is over whether they want all 12 of those behaviors that Pompeo has outlined changed, or if they could live with fewer, in order, in order to reach a deal. But I think that's right. And I don't think the Trump administration, I don't think officials would argue with the idea that, they're putting sanctions in place to try to get the Iranians to the table. I mean, they've said they would negotiate without preconditions, right? And I think the administration has shown that they want to talk, right? I mean, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe went to Tehran in order to talk about a way forward. That didn't go so well. We had Asian-bound vessels attacked while he was in Tehran. I mean, that's really viewed as a rejection of an overture sponsored by Washington.
What do you make of Brian Hook being in Oman?
It's a great question. I mean, obviously it's loaded, and they must know that it's loaded, right? Because Oman was the site of back-channel negotiations before. What I will say is he was publicly in Oman, right? I mean, the negotiations that happened for years during the Obama administration, I mean, we now know about them, but they were done in secret. You didn't know that officials were there. So I think it's an interesting message that they are in Oman. Obviously, the Omanis talk to the Iranians. They've played this role before. You can't have an envoy for Oman go without it being about Iran, right? That's not just a normal diplomatic house call. But Brian Hook has also said there aren't back-channel negotiations at the moment. So
of course he's going to say that.
Of course he's going to, right, of course. But it's hard to know the extent to which that is meant as a demonstration of, look, guys, we're open and we're trying. Look, here we are in Oman, which is the capital of talking about hard issues in the region. Or if it's something real.
Well, I mean, with Trump, there's always this degree of sort of performance, and
absolutely,
and nothing is sort of done unintentionally, or there's always this tendency to kind of make sure what he's done, what he does is sort of public and is publicly consumed. So, I think you made the point previously about, well, Trump's been very clear about the sort of want for negotiations, but I think really what ended up happening in the last year since Pompeo put out those 12 demands of Iran, which basically kind of required capitulation of Tehran to actually meet them, is that people read into that that the U.S. is not really interested in talks, is interested in regime change.
Yeah.
And I think the U.S. has been very clear about never saying those words about regime change. That's not really what we're all about. Even though I think any thinking person in the administration would have a look at those 12 points and know that basically means regime change. So, and then
right.
if you listen to Bolton and others and the Israelis, then suddenly you start thinking, well, that what they're really after is regime change, even though they say they're about talks. But maybe we should have taken them at their word the whole time.
Yeah, I think that's fair, but I think it's also different people in the administration, right? They say they want a fundamental change in Iranian behavior. I mean, how much change that requires, I think I'm not sure that the administration has a unified view on that.
Yeah, and I think the question really is about what are the so-called red lines, and if they back away from things like missiles, Iran's regional sort of hegemonic influence, which I think everyone agrees, and even if you're in the Trump administration, or even if you're the sort of most hawkish Israelis, you know that it's pretty hard to expect Iran to have no regional influence, given how deep its sort of connections with the greater Middle East is. If you take those things as sort of like, well, those are impossible without regime change, and start thinking about like, how could we improve the kind of current deal, or the current sort of things that we can talk about, which, like you said at the beginning, tend to focus on acquiring a nuclear weapon and sort of being a nuclear threat. There are more things that can be done that could have been done beyond what was in the JCPOA to strengthen that agreement potentially. If they're sort of looking at that package instead of the sort of broader package, which is what they had started with, then suddenly you have half a chance of having a common ground where it could potentially be seen as a win-win for both parties, because at this point, as we know, the Iranians kind of used up a lot of their kind of political capital sitting down with the Americans, reaching an agreement that then the Americans pulled out of. So to get them back to the table will be extremely challenging, and it'll take a lot more confidence building to say that, we don't trust the Americans at all because they failed on us last time. Why should we trust them this time around?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. That's going to be a tough sell. And it's also tough for, in order for Trump to do a deal that is essentially just a version of the previous deal that, largely sticks to the nuclear portfolio, he's going to have had to make a political decision that the criticism he'll withstand from the deal's detractors who understand the deal, in and out, that the criticism he's going to take from those people isn't going to hurt him politically.
Yeah. Well, Emily, we're going to have to leave it there. We're just about out of time, but I'd like to thank you for your comments today. It's, as always, great to talk to you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Alex. Take care.